Before I start my prepared remarks, please let me thank Professor Michelle Jarman, Sandy Rudd-Elledge, and Kaylee Holmes, who labored to get me here. They have been kind and welcoming. Thank you to all of you for giving time, energy, and commitment in order that you might be here. Some of you I know have driven great distances. You may have left behind or perhaps escaped from family and obligations. Thank you also to the staff who organized this and the building and dining staff who have made this place pleasant for us. A few points of accessibility and hospitality. We have a limited number of printed access copies of this talk for those whose comprehension would be aided by following along in print. We have over here. Most of these are in regular size font, but we have a few large print versions. Please also know that if you need to get up and move around, stand or sit on the floor in order to be comfortable, I am not insulted. Indeed, I welcome you to do what you need to do. I'm grateful you're here. So I'm going to start with a teacher moment. As I grow older, I'm discovering I'm increasingly comfortable outside of my comfort zone. This is a great thing about growing old. With that excuse, I'm going to do two things to start with that are unusual for me. First, I'm going to start with the vocabulary lesson. Some of you are familiar with this word, others are not. The word is ableism. And yes, I have spelled it correctly, even though it looks wrong. I'm going to use this word today, and I want all of us to be on the same page about its meaning. Ideologies, practices, actions that belittle or limit people with disabilities arise from ableism. Ableist attitudes are those that reflect a fear of, an aversion to, or discrimination, prejudice against people with disabilities. Ableism can be as blatant as a refusal to hire someone because of their disability, or it can be as subtle as the unstated assumption that everyone at a concert can stand for 2 hours. Like racism, sexism, homophobia, sometimes ableism targets people as individuals, and sometimes we build it into our social structures. Sometimes it's purposeful, sometimes it's accidental, and sometimes we live it out unknowingly. It rarely acts alone, and is often compounded or strengthened by racism, by sexism, and other structures of power. Now, it's okay if you don't get all of that right now. For as I go through this talk, I'm going to use this term. Slowly, as in the case with all learning, the little gears in your brain are going to click into place. Later this week, you will probably hear someone say, "That's so lame." And you will know that the expression is ableist. You will encounter policies that make institutionalization easy and independent living difficult. And you will be able to use that label of ableism. You will experience a seminar that assumes that all people can sit quietly, listen, and never fidget for 3 hours. And you will think of all the interesting, talented people you know who have so much to contribute, but who could never sit that long. And you will think about ableism and ableist expectations. So that's your vocabulary lesson. Now, the other unusual thing for me, and this actually honestly is very unusual, is that I would like us to all slow for a moment and take a deep breath. Breathe in big and breathe out big. Do not worry about the noise you make or the garlic you ate for lunch. Breathe in big and breathe out big. Unclenching whatever parts of our bodies are clenched. And in the process, perhaps, unclenching parts of our spirits. I want this moment of breathing in and breathing out because I'd like to start with some reflection about where we are. This moment is a moment in time, which is a moment, capital letters. There's a whole lot to reflect on, to ponder, to wonder about. A few of them. The Wyoming Institute for Disabilities is marking 25 years of activism, actions, and dreams. So happy birthday. This is a big deal. And if you are like every other organization in the world, and I assume you are, in 25 years, you have experienced successes, fulfilled hopes, uplifting bridges, as well as loss, moments of regret, some internal conflict, and some uncertainty. Another moment is that this coming summer of 2020 is the 30th anniversary of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. This important piece of civil rights legislation has been challenged, eroded, rebuilt, and occasionally ridiculed. But it still stands, and it still protects our access to housing, employment, education, transportation, and healthcare. This is also a moment in which, in nearly exactly a year, the US will hold a presidential election. I assume you've noticed. And this is a context that to me feels tumultuous and truly is a historical, unique moment. And nearly every day, I encounter acts of ableism, acts of selfishness, and acts of bigotry. But also every moment, every day, I encounter acts of courage and love and generosity. If the Wyoming story is anything like the national story, or like the Ohio story, or like my story, this is a complicated moment. In the same moment, in the same breathing in and breathing out, there is much to celebrate, much to regret, reason to be exhausted, and reason to be energetic about the future. And I will be honest, I desire a joyous celebration of the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But my heart is heavier in 2020 than it was at the 2010 20th anniversary celebrations of the ADA. And actually my whole body is heavier, but that's a different story. Bold, inclusive movements of disability justice exist alongside selfishness and fear. This contrast jars me. The two realities of despair and hope, community and exclusion, access and barriers exist simultaneously in all of our lives. Lately, the words of disability activist Mia Mingus have been calming me down in the midst of these dueling realities, in the midst of my confusion and occasional discouragement. Her reminder of what I should leave behind, what I wish to leave behind, reassures me. Evidence, she says, of the wholeness we never felt and the immense sense of fullness we gave to each other. We should be leaving behind evidence of where wholeness is absent, where exclusion happens, and where we as a society are inadequate. We also need to leave behind evidence of the fullness that we give to one another, the justice, the compassion, and the small d democratic inclusion of all. These historical moments of reflection and assessment, the moments in which we take to breathe, can be moments of great learning, whether for us as individuals, an organization, a social change movement, and even a nation. I'm going to start with my own moments of reflection. This past summer, I spent 6 weeks in Germany. I find that being away from home in spaces that are not mine is particularly generative for me of reflection. These experiences make me think and rethink my life at home. So long story short, as Dr. Jarman said, I spent my early career researching and writing on the deafblind activist Helen Keller and her teacher Anne Sullivan Macy. Thus, they spent a lot of time living in my head. Nearly a decade ago, I stopped writing on Keller, and I thought she had moved out of my brain, or I had kicked her out of my brain. While I was wandering Berlin, however, we got reacquainted. I unexpectedly found that I had much to tell her, reflecting on her beliefs, her advocacy of refugees, and life and disability in the US since her death in 1968. It started when my touristy hop-off, hop-on bus stopped at the architecturally imposing Babelplatz, and I don't speak German, so forgive me. This is a public square. In May 1933, 40,000 Nazi sympathizers used this square to torch what books they called degenerate, including Helen Keller's 1920 essay collection, How I Became a Socialist. By burning books, they hoped to destroy ideas, scare other human beings, and assert dominance. Keller responded with a very Kellerish public letter. Quote, "You can burn my books and the books of the best, but the ideas in them will have seeped through a mill." In 1938, perhaps earlier, Keller had begun to receive letters from deaf and blind Jews impacted by the Nazis and the Nazi closing of Jewish schools and employment centers. The news horrified Keller, and she sought to convince her neighbor, and this is a lovely coincidence, New York Times editor, John Finley. We all love New York Times editor to be our neighbor. She wanted him to shine attention on this issue. She wrote, "The letters they send me, and oh, I received so many, including one from a deaf-blind poetess, are full of pathetic faith in American goodwill and counsel." In 1939, German officials banned her book called The Journal. In 1941, lamenting Nazi restrictions on the use of Braille. And think about that, just stop there. Restrictions on the use of Braille. She wrote to a friend, quote, "News from Europe is like a stone ever heavy upon my soul." The US public and government, however, remained largely indifferent to refugees. Later, my tour bus stopped at Berlin's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. The damage human beings can do to one another and keep doing to one another is inexpressibly distressing. I spoke to Keller but had no words. Approximately a block away or two is the memorial, what it's called, this is a horrible title, Memorial and Information Point for the Victims of National Socialist Euthanasia Killings. Between 1933 and 45, nurses, physicians, bus drivers, orderlies, cooks, psychologists and psychiatrists, midwives, and teachers, some of them Nazis and some not, participated in murdering at least 300,000 disabled children and adults, particularly targeting those with psych disabilities and those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. In addition, physicians forcibly sterilized thousands of others considered unworthy to reproduce, particularly deaf people. At this memorial, fed by time and additional weightiness, my words fumbled out. This was not, I told Keller, euthanasia. This was murder, this is ableism, and this sucked. She knew all of this. Then, of course, our conversation had to turn to the United States. Berlin had reopened lines of communication between Keller and I had so much to say to her about my world and daily life in the United States. It all tumbled out. I smiled about the frequently brazen willingness of my students to claim disability as their own identity, knowing that Keller would enjoy it. But I prodded her and the universe with a reminder that my students need better educational and medical funding. I knew she would cry with me over the high rates of sexual assault experienced by disabled people. With pride, I told her of the upcoming centennial of my local Center for Independent Living and Disability Rights Organization. And if I'd only known then, I would have bragged to her about your 25th anniversary. She would have been very proud. I mourned elderly people embracing ableism as they fight aging, often insisting that they are not part of those disabled people. Because of ableism, they resist the canes, the walkers, the signed language, and the audiobooks that would be of assistance. I gossiped to Keller about Senator Tammy Duckworth and her baby, and Duckworth's marvelous stories of racing Representative John Dingell, both of them in their wheelchairs, through the halls and to the elevator at the US State Capitol buildings. I told Keller that while the ADA matters, many people still fear asking for accommodations, the accommodations to which they are legally entitled, and that too often this fear is realistic. Then I expressed shame about my own failure to respond effectively when only a week earlier an acquaintance had cracked a supposed joke about undesirable colleagues on the spectrum. Then I got stuck, tripping over my shame, the ableism I'd been reluctant to confront, and the conversation between us screeched to a halt. I didn't know where to go next. But then, of course, I breathed. And I knew where to go next. I'm a professional historian, and thus, admittedly, I have a stake in the study of the past. But I also genuinely believe that in order to strengthen ourselves for the present and prepare ourselves for the future, we need to know our past. In this case, disability history can help us dream disability justice. Disability history helps us live out disability justice. And disability history helps us have the imagination, the courage, and the wisdom to create pathways for future directions. Now, as much as I would love to keep you here for a whole week, in order to thoroughly talk about US disability history, I will not, and I cannot. I will, however, self-promote and encourage you to read my book, A Disability History of the United States. This starts prior to European arrival and conquest, continues to the present, in the land territory that we now call the United States. What I can tell you about in the time allotted to me are some points about disability history and the lessons we can draw from it in order to strengthen ourselves for the present and prepare ourselves for the future. The first lesson is that disability is us. It is part of the human experience. Every culture, every time, every space has included people with disabilities. Disability crosses ideological, geographic, racial, class, and party lines. It even bridges the divide of cat people and dog people. Some of us live concretely on the disability side of the disability, non-disability continuum, but none of us, and I want to say this again, none of us live permanently and concretely on the non-disability side. We age, we acquire this physical condition or that, we get bumped, and we move back and forth between disability and non-disability. I will confess that on the slippery disability, non-disability continuum, I often feel like an out-of-control ice skater. And I don't know if that metaphor works in my own life. I cry a lot less frequently than I used to, struggling less often with nighttime episodes of vague anxiety and turmoil, although I still bite my fingernails at 54 years of age. The change is due to a daily anti-anxiety med I began taking at the time of a prolonged family crisis. Stereotypes about anxiety had hindered my ability to access ease. Somehow I thought that anxiety could never coincide with my small town Midwestern glass half fullness. But it did, and I appreciate my daily medication. I also monitor the state of my lower back and spinal cord with hypervigilance, having once had surgery and having laid in bed for several months. My students, I find, similarly slip around in their identities. When I poll them about their disability, non-disability identity, nearly a quarter always put themselves in the "I'm still figuring it out" category. My point here is that disability is us, and it's important to know that our past includes people like us. Otherwise, we are eternal, eternal pioneers. The first this, the first that. And while such work is important, it is exhausting. It's hard on our spirits, and it's often just not true. A brief example, last month I taught a marvelous new essay about a man named Joseph Gorman, a white man who lived in 17th century New England. He could not write or handle money, but he could beat everyone in town at checkers, and amongst other skills, he could look at a pile of wheat or any produce and accurately give its weight. Gorman's community accepted him and valued his skills. In fact, they highly valued his skills at weighing things. This essay transformed some of my students unexpectedly because it affirmed worth. Some of them struggle to write. Some have siblings or loved ones with autism. Some have autism. Some of them just struggle. This example of a man before them who lived and thrived and who is known to us because of disability is affirmation that we are not alone. Disability history has immense potential to generate real human connections, conversation, and the knowledge that we are not alone. Another lesson from disability history is that divisions amongst people with disabilities hinder getting stuff done. I had a different word there than stuff, but then I changed it. Here comes more history. Prior to World War II, there were virtually no cross-disability alliances within the US. Advocacy groups existed, but they did so only according to diagnosis and kind of disability: blind people, deaf people, chair users, polio survivors, and the like. Within those groups, people often split themselves even further, according to veteran or civilian status, or due to white racism. Unsurprisingly, this made political mobilization difficult. These divisions made it difficult for everyone to advance. Unfortunately, the historical reality is that many people with disabilities and their allies have sought to advance themselves by disparaging other people with disabilities. There are historical moments in which disabled veterans groups claimed employment opportunities by insisting that they had become disabled honorably, but that others had not, and thus those others did not deserve employment opportunities. Sometimes those with mobility disabilities have used ableism to argue that they were the better disabled people, better than those really disabled people with developmental disabilities. Some disabled people from privileged racial or class groups have used their own social advantage to climb above others by rolling over them. This has particularly been the case when entire communities of people have been pathologized as deficient, lacking, or incapable, such as various tribal nations, queer communities, immigrants, African Americans. These divisions amongst people with disabilities hinders getting stuff done. It's also important to specifically point out and emphasize that frequently throughout US history, people with mobility or sensory disabilities have advanced themselves by separating themselves from others with psych, developmental, or intellectual disabilities. Claiming competency or civic fitness by disparaging other people with disabilities does not fight ableism. It only advances oneself. This strategy, I think, strengthens ableism. The exclusion of people with developmental and intellectual disabilities from the disability movement, from dreams of disability justice, harms the entire movement. So for example, more history, I'd like us to consider the sub-minimum wage. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which created the minimum wage and mandated overtime for many workers, includes the much more confusing Section 214C. This section of federal law allows employees to pay workers with disabilities a wage lower than the federal minimum wage. This is called a sub-minimum wage. Intended to reduce barriers to employment, this law has become a means to exploit. In 1938, when it was created, the average sub-minimum wage was 98% of the minimum wage, so a pretty small differential. They were not far apart. In 2007, those earning the sub-minimum wage earned an average of 23% of the minimum wage. In 2015, 34%. These are pretty big gaps. My state, Ohio, has 3.6% of the US population, but over 9% of the country's sub-minimum wage workers. No wonder people with disabilities live with disproportionately high rates of poverty. In Ohio, one employer's federal filings indicate they pay disabled workers as low as 25 and 30 cents an hour for the same labor done by non-disabled employees for $8.15 an hour. The Transformation to Competitive Employment Act, a bill with bipartisan support now sitting in Congress, proposes phasing out such programs over 6 years and developing effective transition programs. This is an example of how folks with developmental and intellectual disabilities got thrown under the bus. And it wasn't even a short bus. Employers, Congress, and disability activists have generally ignored the growing span between the minimum wage and sub-minimum wage. Only in recent years has the disability movement largely begun to pay attention to this growing disparity of the sub-minimum wage. Not only has this been ableist, and I would just say not very nice, it also, economists and I argue, undermines the wages and wage potentials of all people with disabilities. So the disability rights movement has not always been perfect, and it has not rid itself of racism, sexism, ableism, or acted always with justice and love. However, it moved in the right direction after World War II, as it began to slowly organize across disability lines, across racial lines, and across class lines. The 1990 ADA happened because people organized across these lines. We need one another, and that has been shown, and we can do this. The past also teaches us that failing to acknowledge, analyze, or act on the intersecting nature of social structures hinders getting stuff done. In simplistic terms, none of us are single-faceted human beings. We are all actually quite interesting. And none of the issues our nation and world face are single-faceted issues. It's all really complex. So just a bit about 3 examples. I'm going to start with education. Access to a meaningful education matters, and it strengthens the path to a living wage. While federal law started requiring public schools to educate disabled children in 1973, educational inequalities sometimes continue. In 2016, about 67% of kids with a disability graduated from high school compared to 84% of the non-disabled population, so about a 20% gap. State commitment varies tremendously. The lowest state in the nation has a 29% high school graduation rate for students with disabilities. The highest, 84%. So this is possible. Once students get to college, the limited national evidence available suggests that their graduation and retention rates are dismal. Those legally entitled to accommodations often, and I mean 80% of them, do not ask for accommodations due to family ableism, shame, internalized shame, hostile environments, or just the lack of knowledge about how to do it in college, which is different than high school. Those who delay disclosing their disability for longer than a year have a 3.5 times higher risk of not graduating from college. Students with psych disabilities have the longest rate of disclosure, or the longest delay rate. They are the most likely to never disclose their disabilities. Digging into these statistics also reveals that class, race, and gender compound ableism. Students in poor non-white communities are both overdiagnosed and underserviced, resulting in not very good educational success rates. Educational institutions of all levels need to provide quality education. This next example hits very home to me because I live relatively close to Flint, Michigan. And Dr. Schoonhunter brought up this issue as well. In the schools of Flint, Michigan, and increasingly we're finding out elsewhere across the nation, the sight of students at school water fountains is actually terrifying. For years, the public utilities of Flint provided water with extremely high and damaging rates of lead to their disproportionately large African American population. While disability is not tragic, the valuing of capital over human beings, the failure of states and cities to protect their citizens, and the disregard for Black and brown people, for poor people, should outrage us. Disability due to inadequate environmental protections, racism, and disregard should infuriate. Another really complex and multifaceted issue is that of sexual assault. Current rates of sexual assault indicate the personal, legal, and institutional disregard for people with disabilities, particularly those with intellectual disabilities. Men and women have different rates of sexual assault, as do people of different races. Recent Justice Department data indicates that as a whole, the rate of rape and sexual assault against people with intellectual disabilities is more than 7 times the rate against people without disabilities. Amongst women with intellectual disabilities, it is 12 times the rate of the non-disabled population. Predator caretakers sometimes target women with intellectual disabilities because such victims are sometimes nonverbal, easily intimidated into not reporting, or dismissed as not knowing the truth. These issues of educational access, water safety, sexual assault are complex. We need to bring our disability analysis to them and insist that people with disabilities and their interests are considered and included as we seek solutions. A disability analysis alone, however, is not enough. We need to pay attention to age, to race, sexuality, class, and the complexities of just all of our individual lives if we're going to include all and solve problems. Failing to acknowledge, analyze, and act on the intersecting nature of social structures hinders getting stuff done. Part of addressing our outrage, I believe, is the greater presence of people with disabilities in positions of electoral, educational, legal, and policy power. Basically, I want all of you to run for office. As demand of the disability rights movement says, nothing about us without us. Rutgers recently pointed out that of our national elected officials, only 10% have a disability. 6.3% of federal officials have disabilities. That is significantly less than what the Census Bureau says is about 18% of the entire US population. has a disability. We are not represented in Congress. But elected officials alone, I believe, do not disability justice make. So this is where we go forward. As I told Helen Keller, and I'm telling you, this is a moment in time of both marvelous disability activism, dreamed big and bold, and incredibly discouraging cultural ableism. It is a time of excitement and exhaustion. Or if I can go back to Mia Mingus, whom I quoted earlier, it is a time of the wholeness we never felt and the immense sense of fullness we give to each other. The strength of history, I believe, is that it can ground outrage and confusion. We need histories to remind us, in Jonathan Mooney's words, he has a great book called Normal Sucks. He reminds us that, quote, normal hasn't always been normal, and that normality can oppress, can limit imaginings, and can restrain our futures. We also need to know that normal changes, and that prior normals can actually liberate us, can push us to new futures. By grounding ourselves in history, we can move forward. So disability is us, and has been us. We can thus be emboldened by the fact that we are not alone and that others have gone before us. Divisions amongst people with disabilities hinders getting stuff done. Therefore, let us find our commonalities, work together, develop language and strategies that enable us to advance jointly. Failures to acknowledge, analyze, and act on the intersecting nature of social structures hinders getting stuff done. Therefore, don't be afraid of complexity, embrace it. Recognitions of complexity are calls to action. These are spaces of potential for coalitions, for community, and bold imaginings about our future. Most encouraging to me at this moment in time are the activists and scholars who are pushing us to rethink access and accessibility. The disability movement has thrown around the terms of access and accessibility for a long time, and they're important. But lately we've been rethinking them. The basic, and I think we all agree on this, is that we need to meet accessibility guidelines as required by law. We need to obey the law. This is important. Everyone should do that. That, however, is not enough. And I think as a parallel, I need to do more than the law and not beat my children. I should actually love them. We need to move beyond compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act and then go beyond in order to live out access and inclusion. So I encourage you to dream big now that you've reached 25 years of age. Ask yourselves and your people hard questions. What do accessible families look like? How do they work? How does an inclusive community or workplace operate? What does inclusion mean for activists, for community planners, for physicians, for educators, for advocates, for friendships, for nations, and for electorates? I want you to dream big. We need access grounded in hospitality and community, or, dare I dream even really big, access grounded in love. We need Joseph Gorham to tell us how much things weigh. We need, in other words, histories in order to remake our futures. Thank you.
I was thinking the same thing. I think we can do Q&A. I will happily carry the mic around. Please ask Dr. Nielsen some questions or share comments.
I'd love to hear your big dreamings.
Yes.
Just excellent observations all the way through, Kim. Very good.
And that's from Keith Miller, founder extraordinaire. Other comments people want to share?
Wonderful presentation. And you brought up the election. So as you think about the next election cycle, what are you most optimistic about and what are you most afraid of?
Well, as a historian, I'm trying to remind myself that discouragement has always been a prompt for action. So I'm telling myself that a lot. I think that we as an electorate have every right and should demand good things from our elected officials. And I think we just need to do that. Say, look, how are you helping our communities? And we matter as a community, and let's get with it. We cannot let them off the hook, and I think at least I find myself so tired very often that I'm letting my elected officials off the hook. So I'm trying not to do that.
First, thank you. I'm excited to dream big, but I have a question for you. How do you practice accessibility on your campus and in your classrooms?
One, I'm sure I make mistakes, and I think that owning up to mistakes and saying, please teach me, is the way to do it. I am practicing the humble and often very humiliating action of frequently inviting students and others in presentations to tell me where I'm failing. I'm also encouraging folks to expect access and tell me where I'm failing and tell others where we're failing and dream big about access. It sounds like Dr. Jarman, you are thinking about universal design for learning and accessibility here on this campus, and that's great, and that's what we need to do. And I think as all of us go out and be professionals, be family members, partners, voters, we need to expect and live out access. I've been really thinking about it as, hopefully it's indicative about what this means for me in my friendships, in my families, in all of my relationships, as I interact with strangers, to really hold myself accountable about access to go beyond the law and think instead about hospitality and community.
First, I just want to say thank you for coming out.
You're welcome.
And one question that I was going to ask, I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan a couple weeks ago.
For the Arts Festival?
No, it was for a national independent living conference. I work in Wyoming Independent Living now. I was a former student of Dr. Jarman, and just can't thank her enough for allowing me the opportunity to experience life in a different perspective. And another question I want to ask, what kind of accessibility issues do you see? Where are you from? Because in Wyoming, pretty much when you leave this campus sidewalks, a lot of them are actually impassable.
In my community and in Ohio generally, transportation is a huge issue of access. Public transportation, transportation writ large, transportation within academic institutions is a huge issue. And I think that's a place where we need to go beyond meeting the law is not working. I think that on my campus, as I talk with students, students with disabilities feel very isolated. And that social isolation has impact. And we need to create communities that are far more accepting. And again, meeting the law is not enough. And if all of my students with disabilities on campus are frequently lonely, it's just not good. And we need to work on that. So those are two very different issues of friends and transportation, but I think that's the spectrum of stuff that matters.
Thank you. I'm interested, I loved your story of a man from the 1700s who could just magically
way things.
Yes.
And then your own work with Helen Keller. I'm curious, do you have one or two of your sort of favorite historical biographies around disability that we could be using with students and others?
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest, my favorite book I've ever done is my biography of Anne Sullivan Macy. Keller and I don't always get along, even though I talk to her constantly. And I like my biography of Anne Sullivan Macy. It's a really wonderful biography of Elizabeth Tuttle, who was the grandmother of one of the most famous U.S. theologians, whose name is not going to come to my brain at the moment. I really love that biography. I think, there's some really interesting, there's a biography of Genius Wilson that is brilliant. There's a lot of work being done in disability history, and really good work. I can share those with, thank you, my colleagues.
You really kind of struck a nerve with me with ableism. Having been kind of involved in the field most of my life. And I was lucky that when I went to college at Illinois State University, there were no special ed teachers. So I got a National Defense Student Loan. So I've been in the field forever. And I'm wondering if you've noticed that ableism might be particularly found in people like me who have been trudging along, we've been fighting a good fight for so long. It was very thrilling here in Laramie when they deinstitutionalized, a lot of our programming, community-based programming, came from people who spent the bulk of their life in an institution. And it's been wonderful and fabulous to see growth and all. But with college, with different things, we still have the same basic issues. And I think it's wonderful because back then, we didn't really think about what people did with the rest of their lives after they graduated high school. We're all special ed teachers. And, it's kind of interesting that, people have long lives. We have people that were in their 70s and 80s. But those issues and, the whole fight to end sheltered workshops and the minimum sub-wage. Do you see resistance from some of us older folks that are like, well, at least, they weren't making much money, but they were doing something fulfilling rather than just sitting in their apartments watching soap operas. And we've got a long ways to go, and I'm worried now that even I'm seeing struggles between people with intellectual disabilities versus people with the autism spectrum. It's kind of still going on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think just because we live in this culture, we live in this overwhelming ableist culture, of course we inhale that in the air we breathe. And so I think, we need to be gentle with ourselves. And I think that, of course, even for those of us who've worked in this community for a long time, that we find ableism within ourselves every once in a while. I certainly do. And so I think, one, that's okay, right? You're absolved. But I'm sorry.
No, it's perfect for me.
Then I think, anti-racist educators always say that the very most profound step is to acknowledge and recognize racism. And I think that for ableism, it's the same thing. That the most profound step is to acknowledge and recognize it, and then we can talk about where to go. But until we acknowledge and recognize it, we're not going to do anything.
I just was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to where that disconnect is occurring for the high school and college students. Why are they dropping out and graduating?
Yeah, thank you. Well, so when kids are under 18, as you know, right, they don't have a choice about this. It's their parents and school district officials who, in essence, force them to go through this. To seek accommodations. And that can be very helpful. I'm not diminishing that. But once they get to college, they are legal adults. And their parents can't make them. Their teachers can't make them. And for many of them, they then are highly reluctant to go to student disability services and ask for accommodations. I think some students also leave K through 12 really sick of everybody knowing their business, really tired of that, and do not realize that once they become adults and in college, that their professors don't actually get to know their business. You know, for all of us in higher ed, we receive notes about the accommodations that students require, but that's it. We don't know anything else about them, and we have no legal right to ask. So I think sometimes students don't know the privacy that is accorded to them as adults. The national data also indicates that a lot of families push students once they get to college to say, okay, now this is a moment when you should try and do it on your own. And often that doesn't work, not surprisingly. And then I think, so for some students, they just don't do it. The national data indicates that about 80% of students who had an IEP in college or in high school and go to college do not seek accommodations. Think about that, 80% do not seek accommodations. And the national data also indicates that the lower down the economic ladder one is, the less likely they are to seek accommodations. And I think what happens is that upper class families talk about accommodations as a right. They have money to hire attorneys, they have parents with more education, with more spare time, quite frankly, to go in and advocate. And that the lower down the economic ladder, in many ways, the less privileged those parents are and the busier they are. And students, those high school students, have not thought about accommodations as a right. And instead, they've experienced as a piece of shame. And so they don't seek those accommodations. So I think in higher education, we really need to work on this. And I've been talking to all the incoming students at my institution and telling them to get over themselves. And I have begun to use this language, just get over yourself. This is not helpful to you. I don't care about the internalized shame you have, and get over it and get in here and get your accommodations if you want to graduate. And I think we need to use that kind of explicit language with them.
Hi, I've been really interested in your speech and your talk, and I'm interested in whether you think that disability history and this background is something that would be helpful for children or youth with disabilities to have as part of their background and perhaps part of self-acceptance. What do you think about that?
I really, really, really do. See, I paid you to ask that question. As I said, I think being an internal pioneer is really exhausting, and it doesn't help us. And for young kids with disabilities to know that there have been lots of kids with disabilities before them, and that those kids lived a wide spectrum of lives is really important. My understanding is about a third of US states right now require K-12 education to include some disability history. I know nothing about Wyoming. But I think that the quality of that content matters and varies tremendously. I've actually been working with a few high schools around the nation that are using my book within high school classes, but I think just basic inclusion and integration of this into the historical stories we tell kids is really important. And too often, the only people included are inspirations. I think our kids are tired of Helen Keller and Franklin Roosevelt. We need other figures.
I would say we wrote into my son's IEP autism awareness and self-advocacy as a 10-year-old, and it actually was really, really helpful.
That is brilliant.
So thinking about the principle of the nothing about us without us, right? And thinking about inclusion and appreciation of individuals with disabilities from, the perspective of, like you said, like WIND and our national organization, right? Like that's very important to us. From a historical perspective, maybe from a societal level, like how do you think we're doing? And where, like, when did it start with the ADA Act and now it's been progressing? Have we regressed at all? I'm just curious about your perspective on that.
I would like to tell you that it has been this onward progressive path towards better and better and better. That is not the case. I think looking at US history, it's been highly uneven, up and down and up and down and up and down. I think the civil rights legislation that has been passed, including the ADA, is really, really important and is transformative. And the integration of other civil rights legislation into disability and disability into it is transformative. So I think that's a huge movement forward. And even at moments of where disability rights are tested, we can rely on that civil rights legislation. Thank you.
So, oh, that was a lot louder than this. Sorry. My name is Casey Schmidt, and I work for Wyoming Independent Living as an input specialist. And I'll just kind of address what you said about the history. I've been working in this job. I was also so excited to come here today. So
I'm glad you're here.
Yeah. But I've been working in that job since July, and it's been really interesting to see, people who either new to understanding disabilities or have lived with disabilities for a long time. Whenever we start talking about advocacy and the history of disability rights movement, to watch the Lives Worth Living documentary, and our youth transition program has information about disability rights movement, and you see how empowering it is, and how much people really seem to enjoy learning the history of something that involves them. So, yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here today.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I really do believe that seeing ourselves and knowing we're not pioneers matters. I just remember, I grew up in a very, very small town, northern Minnesota, and all I read was biographies as a kid. And looking backward, I think it's because I was desperate for other models. And all of us need those. Well, Kim,
Thank you. We can, Nielsen.